Now, Scott Summers is generally somebody who likes to think of himself as a good guy, which kind of makes all of his wrongdoings all the more interesting, because it means that all of his worst deeds are still things that he can somehow find ways to justify. And while you'd expect that this means that Cyclops hasn't committed many wrongful acts, it's almost the complete opposite. With this in mind, I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 worst things Cyclops has ever done. Number 10. Almost killing a ton of children. Now, within the pages of the collective X-Men comics, there are just enough occasions where Cyclops narrowly evades killing children to raise some very serious red flags somewhere in the back of your mind. A prime example of this lies in X Factor number 35, which saw the hero team throw hands in a child-filled cryogenic chamber against a bunch of villains with reflective armor, something that Cyclops warns against as he fires an energy beam at an enemy that then begins to bounce around the room. In doing so, he narrowly misses zapping several of the children, in a move that could have resulted in some mass-murdered frozen kids. The fact that Cyclops simultaneously recognized the danger of fighting in this room and then immediately endangers all the children in there by doing so anyway is as ironic as it is a kind of terrible move. Number 9. Creating a child soldier. Now, X-23's backstory is a tale of child exploitation and manipulation that is not uncommon in comics, but it's still sad all the same. With Laura having been weaponized since birth by the people behind her creation, it would seem likely that when she finally was recovered by the X-Men, that they would focus on rehabilitating her, and then take her out of any fighting until the trauma of the violence that she'd seen her whole life had at minimum been addressed. But Cyclops clearly doesn't believe in therapy, as within days of her arrival, he sends X-23 out into a revived X-Force team, which is explicitly the worst idea of what to do with Laura Kinney imaginable. It's questionable enough that even Wolverine expresses some serious concerns with the plan, which are then totally ignored by Cyclops, because he is apparently more than willing to prevent Laura from starting the recovery process that she needs, so long as she can help him beat up some costumed crooks. When Wolverine has to be the voice of reason about violence and its potential impact, you know something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. Number 8. Fighting his own team. Now, as a leader, sometimes you have to make calls that you don't want to. Doing the best thing for your team often involves doing things the team doesn't want to do, and helping them become better fighters and better people can often involve clashing with those that you care the most about. However, there is a line in terms of how far it's okay to push your team, and Cyclops crosses that line one too many times for him to be considered a good leader. His decision to insult and then fight his team in order to try and help them regain their spirits from losing a battle is a sure sign of this, as literally nobody is actually helped by Scott's decisions to just viciously turn on them. In a time where every single member of the team could have used encouragement or even just a word of support, Scott's instinctive response is to be a complete monster to his own team, and that's very, very telling as to the type of person he can often be. Number 7. Fighting Wolverine for being right. Now, friends don't let friends lose their morals as a general rule, especially when said friend can shoot city-destroying energy beams from their bloody eyes. So it's no real surprise that when Wolverine discovered that Cyclops had shacked up with Emma Frost immediately after one of Jean's many deaths, he confronted his longtime teammate about whether this seemed to be a wise idea. But what was a surprise is that Cyclops responded to this concern about his well-being by immediately blasting Wolverine with what appears to be lethal force. It's needlessly aggressive and totally out of line, given that Wolverine is right about it being sketchy to hook up with the woman you cheated on your wife with just because said wife is now dead. With Cyclops supposedly being the bastion of control and dignity amongst the X-Men, it feels pretty bad for him to blow up in such a dangerous and painful manner just because somebody called him out on his behavior. Number 6. Being a terrible dad. With Cyclops looking like he's thinking about what he's having for tea in the majority of panels featuring him and a child, it was written in stone from the very beginning that he wouldn't exactly be the pinnacle of fatherhood. And indeed, while Cyclops has had some okay moments with his kid, they are far outweighed by a series of abandonments and moments where Cyclops seems to lack any affection at all for his darling child. Even his good dad moments can get incredibly worrying, like the period of time where Cyclops would take child Nathan Summers on missions with him, where the infant was continually a hair's breadth from dying brutally just because Scott wanted some weirdly violent bonding time with his baby boy. Balancing being a father and being a superhero is basically like walking a tightrope covered in barbed wire for sure, but Cyclops seemed to avoid anything resembling spending time with his son like the actual plague. Number 5. Cheating on Jean Grey with Emma Frost. The messy situation that is Cyclops' relationship with both Jean Grey and Emma Frost is one that has been excruciatingly documented for an almost obscene amount of time. Summers swings between the two like a romantic seesaw, and even when he appears to have chosen one, he still tends to court the other. This debacle reached its peak when Scott cheats on Jean, who he has married at this point, by having psychic sex with Emma, justifying it because they aren't physically doing anything. Seeing Scott's reaction when he's finally caught, however, makes it very clear that he's aware that what the pair were doing is wrong on several levels, but that he had simply found it easier to cheat with Emma instead of actually trying to work through his issues with his wife. While Jean's past is also not perfect, she doesn't have freaky mental sex with anyone, which means that Cyclops is fairly and squarely in the wrong for this one. Number 4. Cheating on Emma Frost with Jean Grey's memory. In a move that is stunningly unsurprising to anyone who's aware of Scott's frankly depressing relationship history, Scott goes from cheating on his wife Jean Grey to fantasizing about Jean whilst being with Emma after Jean dies. It is a bit of a mixed bag, as Emma repeatedly uses her psychic abilities to look like Jean around Scott, purposefully playing into his fantasies surrounding his first love, which naturally creates an incredibly weird dynamic between the two of them when Jean herself is removed from the situation. Their entire relationship involves Cyclops focusing on Jean and not Emma, made even more awkward by the fact that Frost can read his mind and so is aware that she's playing second fiddle to his dead ex. Ultimately, it seems as though Scott should really have spent some time recovering from the trauma of Jean's death instead of moving straight into things with Emma, as it seems exceedingly cruel to continually daydream of another woman in front of your psychic girlfriend. Number 3. Making out with Emma Frost on Jean Grey's grave. Now, grief makes people do some funny things. It can change sleeping patterns, eating patterns, and pretty much affect any corner of your life, whether you want it to or not. But what grief doesn't really do, notably, is to force you to kiss your mistress on the grave of your just deceased wife, and yet it's the very real and potentially very worst moment of Cyclops' entire comic career. While there is an attempt to try and justify it, with Jean Grey's spirit coming back to tell Scott to explore his feelings for Frost now that she's dead, it's pretty clear that this isn't her way of saying, please go ahead and make out all over my tombstone. It's one thing that Cyclops cheated on Jean Grey, as both parties had affairs with others throughout their relationship, but disrespecting her death in this way is another much worse thing entirely. Number 2. Ruining Madeline Pryor's life. Marrying somebody because they resemble your dead love interest is just setting yourself up for a bad time. You and whatever poor unfortunate you marry, of course. Madeline Pryor, Jean Grey lookalike, and all-time most poorly treated wife, sees this firsthand when her marriage to Cyclops results in her having to raise a child pretty much by herself, having basically been abandoned when Scott learned that Jean was back. Scott abandons Madeline 3 separate times, 2 of which are during the time when they're raising their child, and each time we get to see her die a little more inside. In the end, Cyclops more or less admits that he only married Pryor because she looked like Jean, and shows very little grief or even concern when she eventually dies, likely because this clears the way for him to marry Jean and to continue on the steady chain of unhappy marriages. And number 1, killing Professor X. Anyone who knows anything about the X-Men knows just how close Cyclops and Professor X are, with the two sharing an almost family-like bond since their joint introduction in the first ever X-Men comic. As such, Cyclops killing Xavier in Avengers vs. X-Men is pretty much the biggest sign the supposed superhero has gone fully off the deep end. The pair meet on opposing sides for sure, but Xavier is doing anything but trying to fight Scott. Indeed, the old man tells Cyclops that he loves him and that he's worried about the effects the Phoenix Force is having on his mind, with every sentence clearly aimed at trying to create a peaceful resolution. But what does Scott do? Well, he listens to him, winds himself up, misinterpreting everything he says, and then completely obliterates the closest thing that he's ever had to a father figure in the most dramatic moment of the entire comic. It's needlessly brutal and marks the moment that Cyclops ceases to be redeemable in the comic, as this murder is the most evil deed we've ever seen Summers carry out. And there we go, my friends. Those were the 10 worst things that Cyclops has ever done. I would normally say I hope you enjoyed this, but I hope that you got something out of this, because enjoyment doesn't seem like the right thing to say here. Either way, let me know what you thought about it down in the comments section below. As always, I've been Jules, you have been awesome, never forget that, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.